In this podcast, we talk to the artist Sophia Bauer about her research into the soundscapes of Kenyan forests. Sophia uses sound to inquire into the presence of the past in today's world. Inspired by the research of forest ecologist Suzanne Simard, who reframes forests as social networks in which trees help one another to survive, Sophia frames sound as a relational medium. Sounding entities produce pressure waves which move through space, penetrating everything in their way and affecting all of us, human and non-human. We talk about the fungal networks which distribute nutrients from mother trees to weaker specimens, and how sound can be a forensic tool to deconstruct notions of landscape and the hierarchies embedded in them.
Octopus.
Welcome to the next session of the Octopus podcast, which looks at, broadly speaking, what it means to be an individual in a networked world. Today I'm here with Sophia Bauer to talk a little bit about her research into Kenyan forests. Sophia, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
So where do we start? Maybe you can just start briefly by introducing what you've been working on, your research and your project.
My project is called Forestscapes, and I'm researching the impact of colonialism on landscape in Kenya through sound. And for that, I went to Kenya and I researched two different forests. One is a cypress plantation in the Kenyan highlands around Kijabe town, the forest is called Karita Forest Block. It's a cypress plantation, as I just said, and cypress is a tree species which is introduced by the British colonial power, which was in Kenya from 1895 to 1963. The second forest I researched is a tropical coastal forest, which is on the Kenyan coast between Mombasa and Malindi, and this is an indigenous forest. Of course, there was human influence. I mean, nature is not removed from the human, but it is not a planted forest like the other one. I'm looking into these two forests and I'm mainly researching them through sound to find out what we can find out about the place through sound. And I'm recording different sonic materials, which include the atmospheric sounds, but also recordings with contact mics from the trees, more like detailed recordings from the trees, and also interviews with people living in the forests. I also researched in the Nairobi National Archives about the past, the colonial era. I read a lot of forest reports, which also come into the project as in a sonic transformation. Exactly.
So there's several elements you're working with. One is sort of sound and sonic information. One is history. One is landscape. What is it, do you think, about specifically about the forest landscape that makes it a rich area to research sonically, as opposed to other landscapes? I mean, a forest landscape is a particular kind of landscape.
Yeah, so I read this research about forests, which basically says that there's a vital forest network which involves communication of the trees amongst each other. Not only communication, but also really like a social network, which actually is between the trees. And this is somehow really turning my mind when I think about the hierarchies which are in place between human and nature. So suddenly, if you think about that, forests and trees communicate with each other, but they also care for each other. They transport wisdom and things like that. So then suddenly this whole hierarchy falls apart. And something like a construct like European colonialism and imperialism, which is based on a hierarchical structure from above, looking at a topic like that, like figuring in that suddenly other actors come into place, changes this whole hierarchical structure. So that's why I find forest a perfect place to restructure these concepts.
So I'm reading a book about octopus cognition at the moment, and the writer's trying to talk about what consciousness is. And one sort of base level understanding of consciousness or sentience is that you can respond to impulses. So you're talking about the forest network as a social network and exchange of wisdom. So what does that actually mean? Like, what is being exchanged between the trees?
Basically, the trees are connected through their roots. They are connected by fungi. So there's a huge fungal network underneath the forest, underneath the soil, in the soil, which connects the roots of each tree with another one. And the strongest trees in the forest, the big trees, the researcher Suzanne Simard calls the mother trees. She explains that the big trees, basically, they reach the highest up, so they get the most sun. They produce the most sugar through photosynthesis. These nutrients then are transported to the other trees in the forest. Younger trees, which need to grow, which wouldn't grow otherwise, and yeah. So one tree keeps more trees alive. Without these networks, underneath networks by fungi networks, I think a lot of trees wouldn't survive.
The thing which I find, I mean, there's lots of things I find amazing about that. One is returning to this idea of sentience. You can very easily describe a tree as being sentient if it's responding to signals. So if a mother tree has a surplus of sugar and it somehow can detect which trees are in need of that sugar and can release it through a fungal network, and there's a kind of a decision that's happening.
Yeah,
on some level. I mean, I don't know if you can really call that a decision, but it feels like a decision because some are being given nutrients and sugar and some aren't. And if I think about the way that I was taught biology, it was all through this prism of the survival of the fittest and the idea that organisms and genes want to ensure their own survival, so they'll do anything in order to do that. The theory of evolution was developed at roughly the same time as the big European colonial expansions of the mid-19th century. And so it seems to exist within the same paradigm of thought, that you have these kind of like individuals that go out and conquer the world. And that's the prism with which biology was understood. Now, in a world in which we're networked, I feel that we're reading or certainly this seems to be a good example of a reading of our environment, which understands organisms and individuals and entities as cooperating with one another. That doesn't mean that they don't try to ensure their survival, but they do that through a web of affiliations and connections and support systems. That's a kind of long way round of asking you, what do you think it is about these complex forest networks and the sonic worlds that they produce that can help you to research the past?
Yeah. I think like somehow now the research in more areas in the network world tend to be more on networked society. And I think sound is a medium which really encourages that. So it is a medium which encourages relations. It is basically existing through relations and interconnections, and the in-between is forced by it somehow. For me, that makes a lot of sense to look at the communicational network structure through sound. And then also communication, of course, can work through sound as well. So this, especially as humans, we are communicating mainly through sound. Language is sound, and it makes a lot of sense for me somehow to research with that medium and in that manner.
One of the things that's interesting about landscape is the extent to which, if you don't know how long it's been there, you assume it's been there forever. A.L. Weizmann from Forensic Architecture, he talks about these sort of forests which are being planted in Israel, where Israelis go and picnic on the weekends, but actually it's an extremely political program which is building over Bedouin and Palestinian towns and villages, so it's obscuring them. But I think many Israelis that go and picnic there on the weekends, they just assume it's a forest. So there's something about the visible which seems to be permanent. Can you think about sound through those terms in terms of like permanence and temporality?
Yeah, it's very interesting you should say that, because I had exactly that experience when I went to Kenya and saw these cypress plantations. It's a really wonderful landscape, long, tall conifer trees, forests, and I went past these forests several times, and I always assumed that is how it is. They are conifer trees. They're not indigenous to Kenya, East African country. And it could have dawned in my head, but it didn't. So I was kind of, I think, reminded by how the things I experienced in the European Alps, like these kind of landscapes, which are similar. And that's why I didn't question my sight. And this is, it's a really interesting point. Seeing is a really strong sense which has been somehow universalized and stands for objectivity and universality. But it is also just a subjective sense, which is filtered through your body. You filter what you see through your body.
And your experiences.
Exactly, and your experiences.
And your emotions and everything.
Yeah, this idea that it is an objective sense is really difficult to believe if you see it in that way.
If understanding the sense of sight as socially, politically, emotionally constructed is like one way to kind of negotiate or understand the ways in which we also project things, prejudices on the world, how can we learn to listen differently? Is listening for you then, it sounds grand, but would you describe listening as a political gesture, or learning to listen? Or how can you learn to listen? Or how can you learn to listen to the past?
I don't know if maybe it is, maybe it could be a revolutionary gesture. Don't understand me wrong. I don't want to say, okay, we should stop to see and start to listen. It's more like re-evaluating your senses. And because sound has this relational characters, I think it is a sense which is really enforcing network and social engagement. And I think seeing has also the potential to be like that, but it has been hijacked by the past, all these things that have been put on it. We need to listen to our sense of seeing, maybe, or something like that.
Listen to our sense of seeing. Sound is not directional in the way that sight is. You know, the light waves, we interpret them because our pupil focuses them onto our retina, right? And that's one point that they come into, and that we can then read them. Sound is decoded through our ears, which are on the sides of our head, but also we're resonating bodies. The sound waves resonate within us. So it's a much more corporal form of experience, perhaps. Do you think would you say that's fair, or?
Yeah, maybe. But on the other hand, like seeing is also very like emotional and very visceral. Somehow it's really about reconfiguring the sense of seeing, as opposed to just saying one is better than the other.
You were also doing interviews in the forest. Mm-hmm. What was your impression of the senses or sensibilities of the people that you were talking to there? I mean, did you talk about seeing and listening?
Yes. So researching a place through sound for me also meant a kind of general way of researching a place through the sense with which we take in sound. So I asked everybody I interviewed, as the main question was, well, can you listen and can you tell me what you hear? And it is difficult, and this already starts with like our ability or our lack of language for describing sound, or how we hear and how we listen. So I think we can quite well describe what we see, but and how we see, but how we listen, and even describe the sounds we hear is really difficult. It's a really kind of nice exercise. What are the components of the sound? And then I pretty fast realized that I actually don't have words for that.
Okay, so given that you've just said that, can you describe your favorite sounds in the forest? Like, of all the different recordings you were doing, what were the most what captured your imagination?
I mean, There were really cool sounds we got in a cypress plantation. I did recordings with a really sensitive contact microphone, which was stuck in a tree with a nail. And because it was really windy and the trees are not very thick, they really moved by the wind, you can kind of hear the rub onto each other and the tree being knocked, and it makes this kind of aquatic sound through these microphones, which is really nice. But there was a really wonderful recording in the forest, also in the cypress forest, one of the first days, and it was, I think it was a kind of holiday, so there were a lot of people in the forest actually, whereas the other days it was fairly quiet. And people go through it and herd their livestock. There are a lot of sheep and a lot of cows. And there were people shouting to each other. So you had the sound of the wind blowing through the trees, and then a lot of crackling because the trees are planted very close to each other, so they knock each other, and branches crackle and break, and then these shoutings and whistling of the people. So that is a really wonderful recording. But also the interviews we did with the people, a lot of really nice sound and form of language. In the indigenous forest, we went with an old man, and he's really kind of forest guru, and he can identify a lot of bird calls. So you just go in the forest with him, and then he's kind of decodes this sound, which seems kind of like a mess for you, and he tells you, okay, you can hear this bird, you can hear that bird, this bird, and that's really nice because it actually really underlines this statement of that sound is relational. Suddenly you, through the sound, you realize the other beings which are around you, but you need somebody who decodes it for you. Yeah. Or for me, because I don't know it.
Thank you for joining us on the podcast. Tune in for the next session. Thank you, Sophia Bauer.
Thank you.